we'll get a few people in. All right, so we've got 12. So numbers are going up quickly now, that's good. Good evening, everybody's turned up. We'll just wait for a few more people to jump in and then we can, we'll get started. Good to see a few volunteers on the list.
Yes, and our workmates. Hi, Alice. Hi, Amy.
I think we'll just give it a couple more minutes, Nick. There's numbers are still rolling in.
Okay.
Six. Okay, Nick, I think there's 60 people there, so at least 60 people anyway. So for people to, to come in along the way. But if you'd like to make a start, that'd be great.
Okay, thanks, John. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar this evening. My name is Nick Drever and I'm an Environmental Works Officer with Nillumbik Shire Council. I work in collaboration with experts with experts around the conservation of the Eltham Copper Butterfly and the management of council's reserves. A little bit of housekeeping. Please use the Q&A function for questions. The presentation will be approximately an hour long with 30 minutes for questions at the end. Before we get started, I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of the land we are presenting from and discussing this evening. I pay respect to the elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation and extend respect to other Indigenous Australians present for this webinar. I'd also just like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the Friends of the Eltham Copper Butterfly and the incredible work that the group has done to protect the Eltham Copper. They celebrated their 30th anniversary last year in 2019. This evening, John Harris is presenting the webinar, and we're fortunate to also have with us Andrea Sanzano, who is an expert on the Eltham Copper and will be available to answer questions. So a bit about John. John is the John is the Director and Principal Zoologist and Ecologist with Wildlife and Ecology and an ecological consultancy based in Melbourne. He has been passionate about flora and fauna since he was a young child on a farm outside Ballarat. After 17 years of teaching, John's ongoing passion for the environment led him back to working with flora and fauna in 2012, continuing his desire to educate students and community members alike about our unique animals and plant. John works with schools, community groups and local councils, delivering a range of nature-based presentations and activities. John and his team coordinate and undertake the yearly ECB Caterpillar Surveys for Nillumbik and Parks Victoria. And Andrea Senzano is an ecologist with a background in invertebrate conservation. She is particularly interested in the ecology and conservation of the Eltham Copper Butterfly and coordinated the Eltham Copper monitoring program for the Eltham populations for approximately 13 years prior to John taking it on. Andrea has recently taken up the role of Biodiversity Officer at Darebin City Council and is working towards raising the profile of invertebrates amongst the Darebin community. So this evening, John will cover a range of information related to the Eltham Copper Butterfly. However, as we have been unable to run the monitoring program for 2020, there will be a focus this evening on the results of the 2019 surveys. So I hope you enjoy, and I'll hand over to John. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Nick. Welcome, Andrea. Our first involvement with ECBs was about 2015 when Andrea was conducting the surveys, and we were working together at the time, and we said, oh, we'll come out and help, no worries. Little did we know that a couple of years later, we'd actually be doing the work and getting volunteers to help out. So I've just asked everybody to turn off their microphones if they can, and if you've got questions, put them through the question and answer function at the bottom of the screen. We can, Andrea and Nicole and Helen and myself will all be monitoring the Q&A, and we'll stop from time to time if we think we can answer some questions there and then. Otherwise, some of the questions may be answered further on in the presentation. Just going to share a screen with you now. So I get it fired up. Okay, so we've kind of put it out, the butterfly, the ant, and the bush. I wasn't quite sure how we would go about it, but it's a complex interrelationship between three different organisms. As you know, I discovered that we're actually in competition with SAS Australia tonight. So if I'd have known that, I probably would have called it ECB Nillumbik. But anyway, this is what we've got, and hopefully we'll deliver you some information that you may not know, and particularly the information based on the 2019 survey, but also previous surveys up to that. So have you heard the one about the butterfly, the ant, and the bush? Well, it seems like a normal joke that you might share with friends around the table, or maybe at the local drinking establishment or somewhere else. You know, you've heard this great joke. Well, it's not a joke for the nationally endangered Eltham Copper Butterfly, as it survives in only a handful of locations within Nillumbik and a few other areas in Victoria. The Eltham Copper Butterfly is actually a subspecies of the fiery copper, or, excuse me, subspecies of the fiery copper or dull copper, as it's also called. And it's an endemic subspecies. Sorry, I hate prank calls at this time of the night. It's an endemic subspecies to Victoria. So once thought to be extinct, two populations were discovered in the mid-1980s on a site to be developed for housing in Eltham. So began a campaign to save the ECB and to acquire at least some of the land that was up for redevelopment. At the time, I believe, judging on the newspaper article here, from the Diamond Valley News on the 23rd of March 1987, the land was supposedly valued at $4 million and was going to be split up into 71 housing blocks and sold off. Andrew, can I ask, do you know where that site was?
I believe it was around Paulintona. Around that whole area was one extensive area of habitat, and it was all going to be subdivided through there.
Okay.
Then they campaigned to save pockets of that. So
in Paulintona's name comes up. Paulintona was the member for Eltham, I believe, at the time, and along with the Minister for Conservation, Forest and Lands, Joan Kerner, and many other locals said about getting community consultation about what should happen regarding the butterfly. And it's probably, and it is a mark of respect and the efforts that Paulintona put in herself to saving some of the habitat that the Paulintona Butterfly Reserve, which is on the corner of the Eucalyptus Road and Pitt Street, is so named in honour of her efforts to actually save some of that habitat for this pretty much exclusively Eltham identity. So we're going to have a look at, tonight we're going to have a look at some of the local life history of the Eltham Copper Butterfly, its distribution, the Epaulet ants, the sweetgrass area, conservation status, what Nillumbik's role is in conserving the Eltham Copper Butterfly, and then we'll go on and talk about some of the surveys, how they're done, what are the components, how you can be involved, look at some of the data that we've got out of the last, well, in fact, the data we're showing goes back to 2014. And then how can you people, if you're in Eltham, if you're in Nillumbik, keep the Eltham in ECB, knowing that it is an endangered species and it would not take a great deal to actually wipe out or potentially wipe out the existence of that populations in and around Eltham. And finally, we're going to have a look at some of the butterfly food plants that we can, potentially plant in our own backyards to provide resources for not only the Eltham coppers, but also for other butterflies, etc. So let's start off with the life history. And what comes first, the butterfly or the egg? Well, we're going to start at the egg for the moment. The eggs are either laid singly or in small clumps at the base of the basaria, in leaf litter near the base, or on the stems and leaves of the host plant. And thank you to Andrew for some of these photos. So the eggs take around 14 to 15 days to hatch, so roughly 2 weeks after they're laid, the caterpillars emerge from the egg. And if, depending on when the caterpillars emerge, what time of, whether it be early spring, late spring, summer, etc., there can be a second egg laying period each year if the adults are able to emerge from pupas, etc. But we'll talk about that in a moment. So the larva can be up to 18 mils long. Now, that's not particularly large, 18 mils, but considering the size of the butterfly, it's probably quite a decent size for a caterpillar-butterfly ratio. Now, they have what they call 5 to 8 instar stages. Now, that's different stages of development from the very smallest, from the time they emerge from the egg and they grow. Unlike humans that have an internal skeleton, invertebrates have an exoskeleton. So as the caterpillar grows, it gets to a point where it physically can no longer fit within the exoskeleton that it has at the time. Therefore, it has to break out of that, form a new exoskeleton, and that's roughly what the instar stages are. And in many years ago, probably 30 years ago, I actually was studying another butterfly. Who would have thought they would come back to visit 30 years later, and was actually measuring the heads of a caterpillar with a set of calipers. And we're talking, maybe 1, 1.2, 1.4, 0.6 millimeters head with a pair of electronic calipers. And from that, we could determine for that butterfly what the instar stages were. And the same for the Eltham copper. So they've got these growth stages. Grow one, have to split open, develop a new exoskeleton, grow again. So a series of growth stages. So they feed on the leaves and bark of Bacteria. Now, we've noticed doing our surveys overnight that yes, so in the top picture here, they're obviously feeding on the leaves, but we notice that getting towards the end of the season, sometimes they've completely stripped the plant altogether, not a leaf, but the larvae are still on the plants. And from our observations, they seem to be actually nibbling away at the bark. Because when they've moved off, you can see that there's little perforations, little marks on the bark where they've just nibbled bark. Rather than packing up house and going somewhere else, they've stayed on that plant for the entire time, being attended by the ants, even after they've stripped off all the leaves. Now, a lot of the time that doesn't have a great deal of impact on the plant itself, because once the caterpillars have pupated, have gone back into the ant nest and started to overwinter, the plant can put on the plant's still living, it hasn't died, puts on a growth spurt, fresh new leaves for the next season, which are again attractive to the next lot of caterpillars. So they shelter in the ant's nest. So the ant's nest at the bottom of the Bacteria. So they shelter in the nest of a daytime. And just if you follow the cursor right, so this is a Bacteria trunk up through here where the cursor is a moment. At the bottom here is the entrance to an ant nest. And caterpillars will come and go out of that nest after dark and then return to that nest later. Now those nests are believed do not have any queens in them. So they're just worker ants effectively. So they shelter in the nest of a daytime, or if it gets bright. So we'll see some footage a bit later where we've been observing the caterpillars and on the trunk, and they've started to actually move back down the trunk towards the nest while we've been holding the torch on them. So there's obviously that photo receptors there that kind of say, well, hang on, I must be getting daylight. I'm going to head home now, when in fact it's just us holding a torch on them. So they pupate in the ant's nest, and that lasts around 20 to 30 days in Eltham. It can be slightly different periods at some of the other reserves, but that's 20 to 30 days, then they emerge as the butterfly. So from a fairly trivial looking larvae to this copper butterfly. So the adults emerge in November to February, and that depends on when the eggs were laid originally and the larvae emerge. So if the larvae have emerged, say, from a laying in, say, January, February particularly, maybe February, March, they haven't got to a point where they've fully grown to their adult stage, they'll go down and they'll overwinter in the ant nests, and then they'll come out, finish their feeding once the temperature warms up, etc., and then pupate. So even in our early surveys in October, we'll find there's actually some quite large caterpillars, as well as there being some quite small caterpillars. So caterpillars that might be 12, 13, 14 mils long, and others that might be 3 or 4 mils long. Although I must say the 3 or 4 mil ones are a lot harder to find. So once they've emerged, they fly around close to the ground during the sunny periods of the day, often basking on the ground, on leaf litter, branches, in the sunlight. And the males are particularly territorial. So they'll have their own patch where they'll defend from other males. Of course, females can come in. That's not a problem, but it's other males that they want to keep out of their patch of sunlight. effectively, and maybe their patch of Victoria, so the larval food plants. So early emergers, as we said, will lay with young developing quickly over summer, leading to a second emergence of some adults in autumn. So around March, April, they lay, hatch, the eggs hatch, and then they overwinter. So it's not quite a 1 year cycle for some of them. Sometimes there is 2 adult cycles in a year, sometimes there's only 1, depending on when the eggs hatch. So as I said, otherwise, if there's not a second emergence of adults, the young overwinter in the ant's nest. So this is the current distribution of Eltham copper butterflies as we know it across Victoria. So this is taken from the DELP, or Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning Nature Kit site. And it shows that there's populations around Melbourne. So purple is post-2001. The darker grey is 1975 to 2001 effectively, and the lighter grey is before that. So that's pre-1975. So there's a record from Broadmeadows, and there's another record from around Keilor, I think, from the 1950s. And we all know that even in the last 10 years, we've seen huge changes in those now suburbs. Imagine what they were like 60 and 70 years ago when these butterflies may have been occurring there. There is 2 populations in Castlemaine, including one at the Castlemaine Botanic Gardens. 4 populations around the southern part of Bendigo. And then there's 1 population right out at Kayata on the Western Highway. In fact, you go past the reserve as you go through Kayata just before Nil. And there's an old population near Dimboola. But effectively, if that's what was their original range, there's a whole lot of impact happened between that's now left these pretty much isolated pockets of Eltham copper butterflies, ants, and Bacteria. So the habitat loss in this area, as you can imagine, across the western part of Victoria, grazing and into the Wimmera, cereal, sheep, cattle, agriculture, have led to a much reduced possibility for distribution and wide gaps between populations. And then also we've got the issue of urbanisation around Melbourne. If they hadn't been discovered in that 1986 period, and it was because of that urbanisation, because of developments, etc., we may not have a story to talk about them today in Nillumbik, in Melbourne, and much less in Victoria. So effectively what we've now got is 4 areas of Victoria that they are located in. And we're talking, Greensborough, Eltham, side by side pretty much. So one area, the Castlemaine, the Bendigo and the Kayata area. That's the 4 areas across Victoria. That's all there is left. And we're not just talking Victoria, we're talking Australia, we're talking the world. That is what remains of the populations of these butterflies. So zooming into Eltham, this is again from Nature Kit, showing some of the records. So this is the main population that we have around Eltham. So we're talking Eucalyptus Road, we're talking Diosma Road, and that area in that spot. As I said, we've got a record from 1953 down towards the Yarra, one from Hones Hill, which is just near the Main Road roundabout. That's from 1988. It's one from 1978 in Montmorency, one from 1950. Now, the 1950s one is actually close to where Banyule do their Eltham Copper Butterfly surveys at Yandell Reserve. So there's no records from there, but that population in that approximate area survives. And then there's a 1987 from I don't actually, there's a Bolton, probably a continuation of Bolton Street up the back of Bolton Street. So you can see that even 30 years ago, there wasn't a huge expanse. Probably the 1987s and 1988 populations were as a result of Pat Vaughan, who used to work for Nillumbik and its predecessors, and Michael Braby and others going out, and David Crosby, the entomologist, going out looking for these Eltham Copper Butterflies following that rediscovery in this approximate area in here. So let's have a look at the Epaulet ants. So they're from the genus Notoncus. Now, there's two lots of Notoncus species, ant species, that attend the larvae. So we've got Notoncus capitatus, which is the species that looks after Eltham and Castlemaine caterpillars. Notoncus ectotomoides, that looks after the species that attends the species up at Kayata. I'm not sure what the actual species is that looks after the Bendigo ones. So the ants and the caterpillars have this mutually beneficial arrangement, and it's not unusual for ants to have a range, a symbiotic arrangement of sorts with caterpillar, with butterflies, with aphids, all sorts of things, where effectively they farm other invertebrates to benefit themselves. But in this arrangement, it's a lot of the like canid butterflies, so the browns and the blues have these arrangements with ants, and it's called myrmecophaly, where the caterpillar and the ant both benefit and both need each other. So the often where aphids and bugs and things like that tap into the sap of a plant and they fill up because they've tapped in, like with a needle, they've tapped in, and then at the end of at the back end, and obviously if it's going in through the mouth, at the other end, little pockets of honeydew come out and the ants farm that. Well, it's been found that the caterpillars themselves, because they eat leaves and don't tap into this sap, they don't produce that honeydew. So there's this arrangement with the ants. The caterpillars produce chemicals to feed the ants effectively, but they only do that when the ants are climbing over them, and they use their antennae to tap on the caterpillar to encourage it to produce these chemicals. So we've got this arrangement, and in doing so, the ant gets a feed, and the caterpillar is really paying protection money to the ants, because larvae that are attended by ants are less likely to get predated by things like wasps and spiders and other ants, because they've got personal bodyguards. So the ants are giving off a food source in the same time as actually getting some protection from these ants. So sorry, the caterpillars give off the food source and get protection from the ants. But really, it's just a protection racket that benefits the ants, but at the same time benefits the caterpillars and therefore the butterfly species itself. The other part of this story, so that's the butterfly, the ant, and the other part of the story is the bush. And here we're talking about a shrub called sweet Bosseria spinosa. Now it's widely, as you can see on the distribution map at the bottom, it's widely distributed across the eastern seaboard, into South Australia and in Tasmania. Now it's a bush that can range from wettish forests, wettish environments to up into arid, more drier environments. So it has a variation of environments it can survive in. So in that regard, it's has its distribution, the ants have a distribution, and the butterfly has a distribution. And where the three of them come together, where the three of them come together, it's a perfect, it's the perfect match it's the perfect habitat for the butterflies to survive. So the Basiaria, as the name suggests, spinosa. It's quite a prickly bush. Its other common name is also called blackthorn because it actually has quite substantial thorns on it, which sometimes make counting caterpillars a little difficult when you're trying to hold a branch and work out how many caterpillars there are actually on that branch, and you finish up with Basiaria spines in your fingers. So this prickly shrub can be it says a small to medium tree, but it's a shrub effectively up to about 10 metres high. And in the reserves we survey, we find that there's a selective height at which the ants, or which the butterfly, the caterpillars prefer. We'll talk a bit more about that when we actually get into looking at the surveys. So the branches are usually spiny at their terminals. In fact, they can be often spiny along the branchlets, etc. Now they have a creamy white and sweetly scented flower, which is where the name sweet comes from. And they're born in, the flowers arise in fairly thick clusters or terminal clusters at the end of those branches, etc. And the fruit is a flattened, if you can think of an upside down heart shape, the fruit effectively looks like a purse made of two upside down hearts. And when it matures, it becomes brown, so it becomes even more obvious of its shape. So this is actually the distribution for Basiaria across Victoria. So we've got some older records. So the paler green are older records. The dark green are the most recent records. So in the last 20 years thereabouts. So you can see that we've got a little population here where the cursor actually, we've got a little, let's just add a bit of pen here. We've got a little population just here. We've got a population just here. Another one just here. And one out about here. So that's our 4 populations that we have of Eltham copper butterflies, yet the Basiaria is widespread across Victoria. So it's got to be those 3 bits. You can have the Basiaria without the ant or the butterfly. You can have the butterfly, the ant without the Basiaria or the butterfly, but you can't have the butterfly without the other 2. Let's take those off. So I just got a couple of little bits of video of the ants attending the butterflies. Keep your eyes out for the antennae actually vibrating around on the ants, on the larvae as the ants move backwards and forwards. Particularly this ant here, right here, you can see is actually quite busy tapping the caterpillar with his or her antennae. So that's as the caterpillars are feeding. This next video is actually, so we've had the torch on this caterpillar. It's moving down the trunk back towards home. So if you're observant on that, you would have noticed there was 6 caterpillars, 3 on this photo, 2 on the on this part of the video, 2 previous, and 1, the initial one, moving down the trunk. Okay, so they don't get a free ride. There are some predators out there, but we've got photos of spiders and also of larger myrmecia, bulldog ants, etc., actually also predating on the caterpillars. So there's a couple of predators, and there's a number of parasitoid wasps and things like that also impact on the numbers of caterpillars that actually make it through to the butterfly stage, and then obviously that stage then on to breed. And once they're butterflies, there'll be other things that probably pick them off or try to pick them off as well, such as robber flies. Some of the birds, if they're quick enough, may also pick off the butterflies while they are doing their thing in the process of breeding. So the status. So what is the actual status of the Eltham Copper Butterfly? So it's listed as endangered under the EPBC Act. So the EPBC Act is the Commonwealth Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, so 1999, and it's listed as endangered. It's the second highest level. The highest level is critically endangered. So that's one piece of legislation. That's federal legislation. It's also listed as a threatened taxon or a threatened species or a subspecies, etc., under Section 10 of the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act in Victoria. The Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act, lists a whole range of plants, animals, invertebrates, etc., that are considered threatened in Victoria, and has its own criteria for determining whether it's listed. So it's not just somebody thinks it's a great idea and they just add it to the list. It goes through a scientific advisory committee, so anybody can make a nomination about any taxa, so plant, animal, whatever it be. They can put together a nomination. That nomination gets reviewed by a panel of experts, and then they can either say, yes, we agree with that nomination, or we'll leave the nomination active until we get more information, or no, we don't think that's appropriate. That species isn't threatened at this stage. The other, not so much legislation, but in Victoria we have a group of advisory lists, and this is often what local governments use through the planning scheme, etc., to help protect threatened flora, or what are considered threatened flora, fauna, invertebrates, etc. So it's listed as endangered under the threatened advisory list of threatened invertebrate fauna in Victoria back in 2009. So 10 years ago, it was listed as endangered back then. So that's its status. So lots of things are happening around. So if something needed to be done, or potentially somebody was looking to build a house on a vacant block of land in Eltham Copper Butterfly, in areas that are potentially identified as Eltham Copper Butterfly habitat, you could be dealing with both state and Commonwealth law in terms of what you needed to do, or what issues, what surveys you might be required to do, etc., to either prove that they're there or not there before you get permission to do that. So they've got a fair bit of oomph behind them these days, whereas 30 years ago they were thought to be extinct, and well, there's no point having legislation or whatever to protect an extinct species because it's not there. So that's their status. So endangered is effectively what level they sit at, both for Commonwealth and state, under Commonwealth and state legislation. So what is Nillumbik's actual role in conserving the Eltham Copper Butterfly? And this, I think, some people may have some idea about it, but probably to a lot of people in Nillumbik, and particularly everywhere else, what's Nillumbik's actual role may not be well known. So first, the Nillumbik have a dedicated ECB projects officer. That's Nicole Drever that introduced the evening. So as part of her role, the ECB, the Eltham Copper Butterfly is her baby, so to speak. They have dedicated ECB reserves, so such as this one at the Eastern Colony. There's also one at Western Colony as dedicated reserves for the conservation of the Eltham Copper Butterfly. And generally these reserves, the access to these reserves are limited to people who are doing either research or who are doing, environmental works in terms of protecting, helping to conserve the species. They also coordinate and fund surveys. So the surveys that we've been doing for the last 3 years and the surveys that Andrea did before that and others before Andrea, fund surveys and management works themselves and on behalf of Parks Victoria, such as in the Pauline-Tona Reserve especially. So little sign here that's been put up from time to time, you may have seen around the neighbourhoods about ecological thinning and weed control works are planned in this area to protect and enhance the habitat of the Eltham Copper Butterfly and to aid with fire prevention in this reserve. The fire prevention in itself is not only a resource protection for the people living around the reserves, but for the Eltham Copper Butterfly itself. Because there's such small pockets of bush, some are only, hundreds of metres square to hectares square, they're not large pockets. So, for instance, a fire to go through one of those reserves could potentially wipe out the entire population on that reserve forever, unless there was ability for the butterflies to recolonise that after, Basaria and stuff like that had re-established. And they also do a large amount of community education through programs that they run, talking to schools and community groups and providing events like this, etc. So they Nillumbik have an active role in conserving an Australian endemic, Victorian and Eltham endemic species, not only on behalf of the government, but on behalf of everybody that lives in the municipality and everybody that lives in the wider community across Australia. So in that regard, they do. Personally, from what I've seen over the years of being involved in, etc., I think they do a fantastic job. So what happens when we start looking at ECBs? Alice, I'll answer your question shortly if we can. What we do with the ECBs. So obviously we go out, a number of things happen. So the surveys are conducted this time of year, October, November, when the caterpillars have had a chance to emerge, the weather's warmed up a little bit, nights are a little warmer. So each survey, each site, and we have 9 sites across Eltham that we undertake surveys at. Each site is surveyed twice, at least a week apart, sometimes 2 weeks apart. And if it was like last year, then as weather determined, because a number of surveys last year, we had the surveys all planned out. Come the day and it was raining, or one survey we started and then called off because winds picked up and it was too dangerous. We considered it was too dangerous to continue surveys when the tops of the trees are swaying around quite vigorously. Too dangerous for people to be sitting underneath, looking down on the ground pretty much, and not necessarily being aware of what might be happening around or above them. So the surveys get done at each reserve twice. And what we did in 2018 is we decided that the eastern colony being such a large, a relatively large area and a good population, we split the reserve in two, and we did 2 surveys on each half to get some numbers, because we thought there may be a chance that that technique will give us better numbers of actual, closer numbers of actual larvae at the site, rather than just trying to spread out and do the whole reserve one night. Twice, one night each. We also did the same for Pauline-Tona Reserve, and we'll see what happened. We'll see the results from Pauline-Tona Reserve shortly. So they're all across all the reserves and private properties in Eltham that we know, that we currently know have or did have Eltham Copper Butterflies. So there is a couple of private properties that are close to the reserves that have these, that we have permission to enter and do butterfly surveys on. And what was also a road reserve, side of a road near one of the properties and one of the reserves that has ECBs on it. So first of all, we go out probably a week or two before we actually start the actual larvae surveys. We do habitat surveys. And we'll talk a bit more about the habitat surveys and what we look at in a moment. We record the number of larvae, the number of plants using a GPS. Plants are marked with permo tags. So if you've walked around Pauline-Tona and you've seen a little aluminium tag attached to a plant, that's what it is. Volunteers assist with the surveys. On the bigger reserves. So we've worked out that we can get volunteers to help us out with the 3 biggest reserves and the reserves with the 3 biggest numbers. But the smaller reserves we do by ourselves to reduce the foot traffic, especially going through small patches of reserve. So it's easier for one or 2 people to do that quietly by themselves, rather than maybe have 10 or a dozen as we do in some, or even bigger numbers some nights, stomping through a very small reserve. And the surveys at the Pauline-Tona Reserve are undertaken with a Parks Victoria permit. They're not like the other reserves because it's a Parks Victoria estate. So property, managed property, we require, or the surveyors, whether it be us or somebody else, require a Parks Victoria research permit to undertake that research and to put tags, etc., on the plants. So we have that. So it's all done above board, I suppose is the right term. So some of the habitat. So this is some of the things we look at when we go and do the surveys. So around Eltham, they occur in 2 ecological vegetation classes, EVCs as we call them. One, and that describes the type of habitat. One is grassy dry forest and the other is valley grassy forest. Now both those consist mainly of red stringy barks, red box, longleaf box as the dominant trees. The sites are generally well drained and they have a north or a westerly facing aspect. So the slope, faces obviously the north, and the west is where most of the sun is going to hit during any time of the year. The understory is a combination of things like cherry ballart, hedge wattles, the 2 Cassinias, so both drooping and shiny Cassinia, and we'll come back to those a bit later. Sweet Passeria, of course, Clematis, Hardenbergia or purple coral pea, native grasses, mosses, leaf litters, other small shrubs and herbs, etc. Whereas other populations around Castlemaine, Bendigo, Kayada exist in heathy dry forest, box ironbark forest around Bendigo, and yellow box and bull oak dominated woodlands up in the Kayata Dimbul area. So quite different vegetation types to what we find around Eltham. So habitat surveys. So we rock up. Here's our habitat from one of our sites. We rock up, we randomly choose a number of plots that we're going to survey across the site based on the size of the site. So the bigger sites, Pauline, Tona, Western Colony, Eastern Colony, we choose 10 sites. Smaller sites, we might only choose 4 or 5 because they're significantly smaller. So we randomly, before we go, we put 10 dots on a map, and then we go out and we survey those 10 sites. So what we're looking at is a range of what we call biotic, so living and abiotic, non-living factors. So these include how much moisture is in the soil. Are there suitable feed plants, suitable host plants around? And by suitable host plants, we're talking about Bursarias, and we're talking about Bursarias that are primarily under a metre tall. So they are generally the preferred food plants. So we go, okay, how many Bursarias under a metre tall do we have in this 10 metre plot? So we give it a physical number, and we also look at other Bursarias. How many taller Bursarias are there? Because obviously the taller Bursarias are potentially going to be the ones that flower, seed, produce, the seed for new germinants for the plants, for the caterpillars to live on in the years to come. What's the canopy cover? Is there a lot of canopy cover from the trees? Is it not much? Is it very open? Is it sunny? Or is it heavily closed over and quite shady? Obviously, if it's shady canopy cover, there's not as many areas of sunlight, etc., penetrating for the butterflies to sun themselves, to bask, to set up their territories. Is it native or exotic cover of vegetation? Is it mostly native vegetation, or is it exotic vegetation, or is it a combination of both? Is there leaf litter? How much leaf litter is on the ground? And is there grass cover? And the grass cover is just a total cover, because obviously in some areas where the grasses are quite thick, it may prevent the caterpillar, the butterflies from getting to the base of those plants without, so not able to lay eggs at the base of potentially some plants. So that grass cover also gives us a bit of an indication of, what's the accessibility to the base of the Bursarias, etc., or near Bursarias, in terms of for the adults to lay eggs. And finally, what bare ground is there? So what bare ground is there with a chance that Bursarias could germinate in that area and grow to being food plants? So we give all those a scale of 1 to 5, and then we crunch the numbers at the end. So once all that's done, we can then go about setting up our larvae surveys. So each survey starts after sunset. Pardon me, excuse me. After sunset on warm, still nights. Warm nights, the caterpillars are obviously more, potentially more active. Still nights makes it easier and partly easier for the surveyors, because we don't have the issues with wind and potential OH&S issues of, falling limbs, etc. But it's also a lot easier to find, the caterpillars, and there's probably more chance of them coming out during those weather conditions. So using torches, we then break up into small groups. We then scour the area that we're given, looking for Bursaria plants. If we find a plant, so once we find a plant, we then do an inspection of the entire plant, looking for larvae. So we look around the leaves, the branches, we then go down the trunk, look at the base of the plant, etc. Often it's the ants that you see first before you see the caterpillars, because you'll see the movement in the light of these little black ants. And then you kind of, from there, you zoom in and go, okay, so if there's ants there, there's going to be caterpillars. It's not often you see a caterpillar that's not, is not accompanied by at least 2, 3, 4, 6, 10 ants. So we do an inspection of the entire plant. If we find the caterpillars, we actually record the number that we've found. We record the height of the plant. So is it 10 centimetres? Is it 50 centimetres? Approximately. So knee high is roughly 50, waist high is roughly a metre. We take a GPS of all that, so we know where the plant was. And we also have a tag. So if, for instance, this tag here on this photo, if the plant has a tag on it, we read off the tag. So this is our Bacteria that we've just found. We've discovered that there's a caterpillar on the trunk of the plant. So we write down 1 caterpillar. The plant ID here is 46A 2019. So that code indicates it's the 46th plant, new plant, that's been found on survey 1 in year 2019. So right, 46A 19, because if it was this year, we'd know that that plant was tagged last year. If it was last year, we will have put the tag on, we will have put a new tag on it, and that would be the number. So if there's no tag, we put a new tag on it, we record the number, we record the GPS location, and any notes. It might be that we've, for instance, found a caterpillar being attacked by an ant, a large ant, in the photo earlier. So we might make a note that caterpillar was predated on by bull ant. It's a valuable record, but we still know that that there are caterpillars on that plant. We also might note that the plant is completely stripped of leaves. So, and then we move on to the next plant. So once we've done all the surveys, it's then a matter of putting all the data together, which can take as long, sometimes longer than the surveys themselves. And what we found a couple of years ago, that with groups working close together, moving backwards and forwards across an area, sometimes group A would have 46A19 as having 2 caterpillars, and group B would have also surveyed 46A19 and found only 1. So what we devised a system was, each time we check a plant, we put a little mark on the tag so that the other group get to there and go, oh, okay, we don't need to check this one. It's already been marked. And we do that each survey. So the habitat assessment is averaged over the number of plots, so whether it be 6, whether it be 10. So all those figures are 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. 5 divided by 10 is 5. That means there's, the soil is very moist or the soil is very dry. That means that the canopy cover is immense or canopy cover is quite open. So we get an average for that overall site. What we also do, for the larvae surveys, is a huge amount of compilation of data. So we look at them, so we get them, we enter it all onto an Excel spreadsheet. We then go find, sort by tag number. And then if 46A19 on survey 1 had 8 caterpillars, and on survey 2 a week later only had 4, we would record that the maximum number of caterpillars was 8, because we're unsure whether that 4 are the same 4 as last time or whether they are a different 4. So we can't, it's no point saying, well, there's 12 on it, because they may have been 4 of the same. The only time that might happen is if we were to say, might not happen, is if we were to say, well, we saw 2 and they were large, in survey 1, and in survey 2 we found 3 and they were tiny, so we could know that they were different larvae. We also record the number of host plants. So how many plants did we have across that reserve? So we sort all the tag numbers and go, okay, 46A19 was surveyed on the first one and the second one. Okay, that's one plant. And so so in doing that, we compare the permanent tag numbers. So this little table on the left here, let's have a look at Pauline toner. So this was for last year. So the larvae on count 1 was 391 on 132 plants, and we had 7 volunteers. And mind you, Pauline toner is split in 2. So that's over 2 nights. On the second count, again over 2 nights, there was 251 caterpillars on 107 plants and 9 volunteers. So in total, those 2 numbers, we've worked out that, plant A had 5 in first time and might have only had 3 the second time. So in total, when we add up the highest number for each count or for each plant, we came up with 581 larvae on 209 plants, and we had a total of 13 volunteers across the two weeks. But what we also noticed was that new plants compared to the year before, there was 104 new plants that had tags on them, that we put 104 new tags on. The plants from 2018, or again used in 2019, there was 78. Ones that were recorded in 2017 being used in 2019, there was 23. And ones recorded in 2016 and again in 2019, there was 20. So we can say, well, 3 years ago, that plant was being fed on by caterpillars. And again, 3 years later, it's still being fed on by caterpillars. Now, I think the oldest plant we got last year that had a tag on it that had been recorded as being a host plant was back in 1998. So that's like 22 years of data, or 21 years that plant has been providing food as a host plant for the Eltham Copper Butterflies. And then what we get, so this gives a bit of an overall picture of the data rather than coming up with numbers that are combined and we've got a huge number, but in fact, probably half of them were what we've found previously. So this is a bit of a graph looking at the population of the 5 reserves that we have data for from 2014. 2014 we had 5, 2015 we had 7, 2016 and 17 we had 8 areas that we surveyed, and then 2018 and 2019 we surveyed 9 different areas. So this is just the 5 that we have continuous data for from 2014. So as you can see, at 2014, there was between 200, I think it was around 250, up to about 1,130, 1,180, 1,380 thereabouts, about 1,900 in 2018. And then last year it dropped back to around about 1,300. And these red boxes actually show the number of plants, the number of host plants that caterpillars were recorded on. So you can see it pretty much follows the same trend. 2014 was a pretty lean year, and that may have been due to circumstances in 2013, etc. And then the numbers have gone slowly risen to 2018 was a bumper year, and then they've kind of tailed off a bit last year. Now that could be because of the weather conditions last year, the rain, the sun, the rain, the sun, etc. Surveys finished slightly later in 2019 than they did in 2018 because we had, abandoned surveys or surveys that were when planned couldn't happen because of weather conditions. So That's just the 5 reserves. Now, if we look at the results from the Paulintona Reserve, going back as far as we know we've got data for, back in 2007, they had 25 caterpillars. 2012, there was 21, and then it's slowly gone up to 757 last year and back to 581 in 2019. We've got some maps I'm about to show you of the distribution of caterpillars from 2017, 18 and 19. So this is the Paulintona Reserve. So this is the results from 2017, and this little reserve here is what's called Pitt Street Reserve. So the numbers you see on the table here, the light blue circles are 1 to 2 larvae per plant. The mid blue are 3 to 5, the darker blue are 6 to 9, and the darkest ones are 16 plus. There was none in that 9 to 16 category, but these are 16 plus larvae on one plant. So these are little numbers. How many occurrences there was of one or two larvae on a plant? 81, 28, 5, and 1. So this is where we got them in 2017. Notice there's a little hot spot here and a hot spot over on the western boundary. So this is the corner of Eucalyptus and Pitt Nyora Road, in that corner just there. 2018, the split, the black line indicates where we split the reserve in two, and we counted this side one night and the other side the next night on 2 occasions. So there was 4 surveys on the actual reserve over the 2 nights. So from there, we went from, hang on, let me just go back one. The number was 266 in 2017. 2018, we got 757 larvae. And there's 1, 2, 3, there's 3 that had 4, there's 4 that had 16 plus larvae. There were 6 that had 10 to 15 larvae. There was 161 that had 1 to 2. So when actually effectively doubling our effort, we more than tripled the number of, we pretty much tripled the number of larvae that we found. Particularly in this area here, whereas in 2017, there was nothing in there. 2018, there's quite a good patch. And again, in 2019, although numbers went back to 580 odd, there was still a good connection of plants through here. But none of those had, or 1 had 16 plus, 4 had 10 to 15. And there's even a couple found outside the fence on the roadside. But you can see there's a good consolidation of numbers in that reserve. So what are some of the management issues for the Eltham Copper Butterflies that Nillumbik undertake? So supplementary planting of sweet Bursera in some locations. This location here is a small slither, triangular slither of reserve that goes between Lalahang Court and the Woodridge Linear Reserve. So there's been some planting up of Burserias in that area, staked up with bags, etc. The removal of grasses from around the young Burserias so that butterflies can get down there to lay on the trunks, the stems, the roots, around the leaflet, around the base, and give the plants a bit of a helping hand without the competition from the grasses, etc. Removal of some native shrubs and creepers that take over sensitive areas. Now, we talked about Cassinias before being part of the ecosystem. One of the Cassinias can become quite dominant, take over areas where Bursera are trying to grow as well, so out-competing or competing with the Bursera. So in some areas they have been removed just to keep the Burserias, give the Burserias a bit more of a helping hand, again, reduce the competition. And creepers, some of the native creepers will climb over the Busserias, almost smothering them, making them less usable for the caterpillars and the butterflies. Trimming plants to encourage fresh foliage. So in Toner, especially a few years ago, they cut the stems of many of the Busserias, which meant that they resprouted. And in resprouting, they had a lot more fresh growth, which the caterpillars find obviously more nutritious. It's easy, it's sweeter, it's nicer to eat than the old, hard, tough stuff. So they've done that in a number of locations to in fact, some good results, good effect. And also just the removal of weeds across the reserve that have the possibility of impacting, taking over a patch of reserve, which is in fact, suitable for the butterfly. So how do we go about keeping the Eltham in Eltham Copper Butterfly? It would be a tragedy for a butterfly named after, the little Eltham location to actually disappear from Eltham. So how does the council, and we've seen how Nillumbik does it and how Parks Victoria, what kind of things they do with it. How can we as people, maybe residents of Nillumbik or others, how can we help keep that Eltham in ECB? Okay, so one is join the Friends of the Eltham Copper Butterfly. As Nicole was saying earlier, they had this 30th anniversary last year. And they do, vital works in some of those ECB reserves, helping to, do some of those management tasks that we just spoke about. Pardon me. You can volunteer to assist with the Larvae Surveys when we do them, and obviously this year's a bit of an anomaly for many ways, but the COVID has meant that volunteer surveys, and in fact surveys in general, aren't happening. And I'm sure everybody can understand that. Plant Indigenous plants in your garden. Register for the Gardens for Wildlife program on Nillumbik's website. So if you go to the environment page that we showed you before, there should be I type in Gardens for Wildlife Nillumbik in Google. You'll come up, there'll be a registration page there talking about what the Gardens for Wildlife program is. And also reducing your impacts, our impacts on the ECB reserves. So we're going to have a quick look at these before we finish. So Andrea and I are the administrators of the Eltham Copper Butterfly Facebook page. Talks a bit about the reserve, talks about when butterflies have been observed flying. It's also where we advertise for volunteers. We obviously have a substantial list of volunteers, and there are many volunteers who are here tonight, actually observing this presentation tonight, and just a shout out to you all. Put up information about Eltham Copper Butterfly, put up information about the surveys, and it's not just surveys for us. Other people from areas like Castlemaine and Bendigo want to know how they can be involved, and we can put them in touch with the people doing the surveys up in their own areas. So that's one form. If Facebook's not your thing, well then Nillumbik also advertise when the surveys are happening. And you can just drop us a line, you can give me a call, whatever, and just say, look, we'd like to register for the surveys coming up. Give us and we'll let you know when the dates are, and you say, okay, well, we're available 25th of October, we'll be available, and there's 3 of us. And that's pretty much it until you turn up on the night. We'll tell you where we're going, what reserve we're looking at, etc. So that's the Facebook page. Some of our volunteers, now I know Bug Boy's, who's on the left of the image there, he's actually here tonight. The lady in the middle is one of the ladies that runs, Kylie, that runs the survey program for Banyule, and a couple of our cheery volunteers. So this is the Pauline Tona Butterfly Reserve gate on the corner of Eucalyptus Road and Pitt Street. Community groups like Scouts, etc. Sorry, Andrea, but that's a good one for the community groups. Scouts have come out and helped us and helped over the years as well. So, and it's good, you know, they can, Scouts and Cubs and things, they can come out for a period of time, help us with the surveys, and that obviously goes towards some of their environmental, you know, badges and things like that that they might have. And it's not only local. Pia is from Germany and Maxime is from France. They were two of the volunteers we had last year. So we had actually had a number of international volunteers last year that happened to be in Melbourne or around, working at the time, doing other things, heard about it and wanted to come along and volunteer. So that's the Western Colony, or they're outside the Western Colony there. So it's not just the locals that find you know, at a good activity and you know, a rewarding activity to do. It's ECB goes global almost, particularly last year. So the next bit, we're looking at planting Indigenous plants. Now, if you've ever crossed the Nullarbor and you're going to ask, what has that got to do with planting Indigenous plants? Just bear with me for a moment. This is the Nullarbor Roadhouse, smack in the middle of nowhere, on the trip from Perth to Melbourne on the Nullarbor. We'll come back to why I've put that photo in shortly. So Indigenous plants themselves, so we're talking about local plants that grow in the local reserves, grow in the bushland nearby, often require less nutrients, and once they're established, less water than exotic garden plants. So they're almost a set and forget. We've got them established. Nature will pretty much take, you know, do what needs to be done, and they'll thrive quite happily. They provide shelter and food resources for a whole range of local wildlife, such as the butterflies, but also birds, reptiles, mammals, and frogs, depending on obviously what plants you buy. But as we're focusing on the butterflies, whole range of shrubs, and we'll look at those in a moment. They can provide the ECBs with food resources, much the same as roadhouses do for travellers. So if you're a little butterfly that's no bigger than well, not much bigger than a 10-cent piece, and you're trying to move out of your colony at Pauline Tona and find somewhere else to live, and the only other spots are nearby, but you can't fly that far because you need to feed along the way. If somebody's gone out and planted a whole range of Indigenous plants that provide flowers, that nectar sources for you to feed on, you can kind of hopscotch your way, or, you know, across the landscape, so that you can leave one colony and potentially find yourself another colony or other areas where you can breed. Hence my analogy of a roadhouse being in the middle of nowhere, providing resources for the travellers, as an analogy for Indigenous native plants, providing habitat, corridors, food resources for animals, not only butterflies, but all sorts of animals as they move out from areas where they might have been bred. So looking at this, the red in the middle is Pauline Tona Reserve. Now we keep talking about Pauline Tona Reserve, and the reason why I mentioned Pauline Tona Reserve rather than focus on the Nillumbik reserves itself, Pauline Tona has a nice network of tracks and things through it that people can come and go, move through, enjoy the environment, potentially see Eltham Copper Butterflies as they're flying around. The other reserves are more just dedicated to the conservation of the ECBs and generally don't have public access or walking trails, etc. So by kind of focusing on Pauline Tona, we're giving you an option where you can go stay on a track and potentially see these butterflies. But what we've done is we've created a 200-metre buffer around each of the reserves as a potential where the butterflies could potentially, if they left one reserve, that might be about as limit as far as they could travel without needing to stop, find some food, etc. The little one, the orange one down the bottom of the screen, that's Hones Hill, down near the roundabout. So that is still a, you know, although we haven't found any larvae in the last couple of years, that is still a potential habitat for them. So, and this kind of gives you an indication about, well, in this area, if we planted some indigenous plants, we could very well be enabling the Eltham Copper Butterfly and other butterflies and other birds and all sorts of other things, a habitat, a corridor, a roadhouse from one location to another, because the last thing we want is for them to be stuck in their own little reserve, not able to interbreed with others that are only a few hundred metres away because they can't bridge the gap between the reserves. So by producing areas where we've got native plants, etc., that they feed on, we can hopefully provide them those corridors for them to move across this area and potentially move further out, given that there is potentially suitable habitat round through here. So some of the food plant, in fact, if I go back, this little line here is Peppermint Grove, and I did see Phil, I think it was Phil was in earlier. Got a phone call from a resident of Peppermint Grove saying, look, we're wanting to kind of, myself and a few of the residents of Peppermint Grove would like to try and do something for the Eltham Copper Butterfly. How can we go about it? So my suggestion was talk to Nicole and potentially plan up, use your street as a corridor to create a corridor of habitat. And what they've done is got everybody on board in the street. They've got some plans through the Gardens for Wildlife program, and they've planted up that, you know, that area, or they're planning up that area to provide one of those corridors from here across to some of the other reserves over here. That's just one example of, you know, some community action on a group situation in just providing a bit more habitat. So some of the plants we've got Yarra Bergen and we've got Clematis. So these are the food plants for the adults, nectar sources effectively. We've got Sweet Bosseria, so hence the food plant for the adult and for the larvae. And this is these little brown purses that we spoke about earlier when we were talking about the plant. These are the seed pods. We've got dogwood, or the cassinias. There's a couple of different species of cassinias, and we've mentioned those before as being thinned in some areas because they are taking over, but they also are a food source for the adults. So it's a sensitive management about keeping a food source, but at the same time removing competition for the Bosserias that the larvae live on. So it's a fine line almost between managing for the an adult food resource and a caterpillar or larvae food resource. So where can we get some more info on what local plants and what support we might be able to get? Well, there's a Nillumbik document called Live Local, Plant Local. Put that into your search engine and it'll take you to a PDF version. In that document, it talks about all sorts of native plants that can be used not only for habitat for ECBs, but also habitat for local wildlife in general. You can go and check out the Nillumbik environment page, where it has options for grants and things that you can do, resources, etc. You can pick up some local plants from Indigenous nurseries such as Edendale Farm and also Friends of the Warrandyte State Park, so Faust there in Warrandyte State Park on the Manningham side of the river. Indigenous plants, and these are just two examples. There are other Indigenous nurseries around that probably will have Indigenous plants from the Eltham research, Warrandyte type areas. Sorry, let me just go back. So there's a couple of options there. Check out that Nillumbik environment page, look at that Plan Local, Live Local, Plant Local document, or even chat to some of the nurseries, and that they would be able to potentially give you some advice and also provide you with the plans. So the last thing that we want to look at is how do we go about reducing our impacts on the local environment. Now, this lady here was observed last weekend after collecting, last weekend as in 2 weekends ago, preliminary final semi-end, collecting a whole bag of branches and sticks and stuff out of Paulintona Reserve. When spoken to, she seemed to be fairly aggressive. Didn't really like, it's none of your business, I'm doing what I'm happy to do, but it is actually an illegal, it's illegal to remove any vegetation, etc., from a Parks Victoria reserve. So one, how do we reduce our impacts? Stay on the tracks in the reserves to avoid trampling native plants. If you go off the tracks, you don't know whether you're stepping on orchids, whether you're stepping on young Basserias, you're stepping on native plants, it could be food plants, for all sorts of things. And if you finish up stepping on logs, etc., you could very well be squashing any fauna that might be living under those logs. And if you're removing logs and branches and things like that, you're actually removing habitat and basking spots for things like ECBs. So stay on the tracks. Don't remove the sticks and other habitat, because I said that's part of the habitat for not only ECBs, but for a whole range of other animals. And it might not just be the animals that are directly related to the ECBs, it might be something completely different, but combined to bring that whole ecosystem together. Put garden waste in your green bin. Don't throw it over your back fence, because often it contains a whole range of garden plants that are weeds. And those weeds, if they get into the native environment, can become environmental weeds and take over. Things like wandering dew is a very good example. Agapanthus is another example. Arum lilies, where garden plants that have just escaped or been dumped because we can't be bothered putting it in the green bin or whatever, and they've started to take over. Therefore, somebody actually has to go back and manage them and remove them. So garden waste bin is for garden waste, the back fence is not. Report any incidents to Nillumbik that you see in and around the reserves, if it's people in there on mountain bikes or all that type of stuff, anything that might be actually impacting on the environment, report it to Nillumbik. If it's in parks, if it's in the Paulintona Reserve, they'll pass it on to Parks Vic, and Parks Vic hopefully will follow up that also. Control any litter that might be around your own area, maybe neighbours, etc., because all that impacts on the environment also. And stay out of the ECB dedicated reserves unless you're there for a particular reason, like you are helping to volunteer for a camp or something. So that's just a couple of ways we can reduce our impacts on the actual reserves themselves. And that is that. But I'd just like to thank Nicole Drever and Kate Shannon from Nillumbik, Parks Vic, Victoria, Andrea for her years of help with our surveys, mentoring, etc., and for passing it on to us in the first place. We've really enjoyed the last few years of actually doing the surveys and mixing with the volunteers. And a thank you to the volunteers. We've probably had over 60 volunteers in the last 3 years from far and wide. As I said, we've had international volunteers, we've had volunteers from down the peninsula, other side of Melbourne, lots of people from Nillumbik. Thanks to the friends of the Eltham Copper Butterfly for the work that they do in managing the reserves. And also thanks to the private landowners who manage their properties for Eltham Copper Butterflies and allow us to actually access their properties to do the surveys. So that is the end of the presentation. Now, there was a few questions.
I've tackled quite a few questions, but there's a couple there which we'll probably need to get back to people on. So I'm happy to keep a record of those and then provide a bit more information. I can talk to you about that, John, if you like.
Yeah, that's right. I'm just answering Carolyn at the moment. Not sure the woman wasn't fine, but Parks, Nillumbik and Parks Vic were notified that that was happening. I suspect it might have been, it happened to be after the Better Homes and Gardens episode where Melissa King was talking about going out and collecting timber to create orchid hangers and things like that. And I thought that was the first thing that sprung to mind anyway. But anyway, so last week, that's probably episode next to the pond. It's just in regards to that, it's only a couple of Bursarias that are actually outside the fence along Eucalyptus Road. If they've probably, depending on what type of herbicide they've used, if they've used a grass herbicide, that wouldn't have any impact on the Bursarias themselves. But I can't say too much on what the herbicide was or whether it would have much more impact. But there's only, I think it's 3 plants only that are outside that fence line. Improve nectar and potential on pillars. Oh, I know. I think we'd have to Nillumbik and Banyule. We would have to, Nick or somebody would have to provide an answer for that. But I think that's. Is there any other questions? Can I ask while we're there? Does. If there's no other questions, I'm happy to hand it back to Nicole or Helen to finish off. It's just this presentation will be, I believe, is being recorded and will appear on Nillumbik's website. So if you've got friends or you'd like to go back and check out some of those links that we provided, etc., yeah, it'll be up on the website in the coming weeks or coming days, I hope. But yeah, thank you everybody for attending and for your interest.
John, much appreciated, and thank you, Andrew. Just fantastic. Thanks everyone for coming and participating. It's wonderful to have so much interest. So we hope you've learnt a lot and we look forward to doing more with you.
Yeah, and look, if you're interested in the surveys, keep an eye out for information next year, because obviously, hopefully, fingers will be crossed, we'll be back to some sort of normal, whatever that is, post-COVID. But yeah, we're hoping that surveys to continue next year. So just keep an eye on the Facebook page or on Eltham, on Nillumbik's website, etc., for that information.
Marvellous. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, good night.
Good night.
Thanks, John. Bye, Andrea.
Hey, Helen.
Hang on, so.
Can we keep a record of the questions that were asked?